Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Kohler Group's expansion into China webinar series. This is part 3 of 10 webinar sessions. The title of today's presentation is Establishing a Legal Presence in China. First of all, a short introduction of our topic today. Establishing a legal presence in China is not as straightforward as incorporating an entity in the Western world. There are several aspects that require due consideration, including the general business scope and activity of the entity, which needs to be clearly defined from the start of the incorporation. The physical office requirement for the entity as its registered place of business. The structure and budget of the investment that need to be carefully thought through. The opening, operation, and maintenance of 3 sets of bank accounts in China for continuous operations. In this webinar, we will discuss these topics in greater detail, as well as go over a pre-investment checklist as your guide to success. I'm very pleased to have our director at Kohler Group, Mrs. Christina Kohler-Coluccia, as our speaker today. Before we begin today's presentation, allow me to settle some administrative matters. I would like to make sure that the sound system is working perfectly. If you could hear the introduction and you can hear me clearly, please click the hand button in the control panel, which will give me the signal that we have no technical issues. If you're using your computer and mic and speaker system and you have trouble listening, please note that there is the option to dial in via the telephone by simply clicking this in the audio section of the control panel. Please note that we are recording today's webinar session, and the presentation, together with the recording, will be distributed on the registrants, to the registrants by the end of the day. Ladies and gentlemen, as we do in all our webinar sessions, we do encourage all attendees to submit their questions as well as comments into the questions section of the control panel. The presentation today will last approximately 45 minutes, after which we aim to have a 15 to 20 minutes Q&A. Please don't be shy in inserting your questions or sharing experiences. I will now pass the microphone to Christina, who will introduce Kohler Group and herself, and will then begin with today's presentation.
Thank you, Barbara. Thank you to all the attendees that have joined us today for Kohler Group's Expansion into China webinar series. For those of you that are new to Kohler Group's series, I would just like to briefly introduce who we are. Kohler Group, a CSC company, provides a wide range of market entry consulting, incorporation, tax, accounting, and human resource services for companies that are expanding into the Asian region, but also companies that are expanding within the Asian region. Our firm has just over 120 professionals that are located throughout our 10 offices regionally. We've been established since 1979, and our main objective has been to assist companies not only with their market entry, but their expansion within the region. And obviously, each company's strategy in terms of entering the market is quite different. So our objective is also to tailor-make certain solutions for companies. A little bit about myself. My name is Christina Kohler-Coluccia. I'm a director at Kohler Group. I've been with the firm since 2003, when I first opened our Shanghai office. Since then, I've grown our operations in China to having 8 offices and just over 60 professionals working throughout. I've been assisting clients with market entry, expansion, mergers and acquisitions, and unfortunately liquidations from the market as well. I'm co-author of our monthly magazine, ChinaInvest.biz, which highlights all the latest trends and regulations that are occurring throughout the region. And if you're interested in subscribing to it, it can be done so on our homepage. Now, without further ado, let's begin with today's presentations. The title is Establishing a Legal Presence in China. So the first objective for all of you is understanding what type of legal presences actually exist in the Chinese market. Now, I'm sure a lot of you have researched, have Googled, and have come up with a variety of terminology that is utilized. Today, I'm going to be providing you with my definition and my interpretation of the terminology that is used in China, which may differ depending on a variety of consultants that you speak to or lawyers that you speak to. But ultimately, the main form of establishing an entity in China is a limited liability company, an LLC, similar as to what you have anywhere else in the world. The issue is how the Chinese government markets the term LLC. So if you have Googled and researched, you would have found the terminology wholly foreign-owned enterprise, a WOFE. What this simply relates to is the shareholding structure of an LLC, meaning that the shareholder is a foreign investor. It is wholly owned by a foreign investor. Now, what you need to then relate it to is the business scope and the activities that are going to be formed under this LLC. Now, under my definition, under a wholly foreign-owned enterprise, meaning that it's 100% owned by a foreign shareholder, it's still a limited liability company, you can have management consulting firms, information technology firms, recruitment firms, architecture design, logistics, restaurants, any type of service-oriented industry. Now, in 2008, the Chinese government finally came out with the regulation that foreign investors could do trade transactions, whether it was import, export, or domestic trade, by themselves without using an import-export agent. As such, to make things much more fun, they created another term, which is called Foreign Invested Commercial Enterprise. Again, it's an LLC. The shareholder is a foreign investor. The only difference is then related to the business scope and the fact that you are able to do import and export functions, meaning wholesale trade, retail trade, e-commerce, manufacturing, etc. So when you are Googling and when you are researching setting up a presence in China, be wary of this terminology and just know you're setting up an LLC. This goes on, again, to the shareholdership, and there are other types of LLCs that can also be established. One is a domestically invested enterprise, which basically means the shareholder is a mainland Chinese individual or corporate entity. You have joint ventures where you have two shareholders or even more than two shareholders, but it's a mixture of shareholders. You have a foreign investor and a mainland Chinese investor. You also have foreign invested partnerships, which is a form that is very rarely used in the Chinese market, but it is a type of joint venture structure. The only differences are really related to the outcome, the dividend distribution at the end of the day. And then you have representative offices. Now, a representative office is not, and I repeat, is not an LLC. A representative office is purely a liaison office. It's a marketing office. It's a merchandising office where no contract formulation or signing is being done in that office. In addition, the representative office should have a small quantity of employees who liaise between the parent company and the offices located locally, or the suppliers or customers located locally in mainland China. It is tied to the parent company, so the investor must be a corporate entity. It cannot be an individual. And representative offices, although I will be speaking about them later on in the presentation, are becoming less and less common when entering the Chinese market. Now, when you are setting up an LLC, you have to be wary of one of the documents that has to be created, which is the Articles of Association, or another term would be the Memorandum of Understanding. There are certain key points that need to be included within the AOA. And one of the biggest mistakes that we have seen with companies coming into the market is that they take the standardized template AOA from the Chinese MOFCOM or the Chinese Administration of Industry and Commerce, and they don't expand on it, and they don't add certain articles within it. So the Articles of Association are really there as a protector and as a guideline of how procedures should occur within the Chinese entity. So if you want to terminate senior management, you want to terminate people within the corporate structure, if you want to sell the company, if you want to exit the market, if you want to do a share transfer, all of these items need to be within the Articles of Association, and most of the time those articles are not within the template provided by the Chinese government. So you do need to read through them carefully. You do need to have external advisory to assist you in drafting the best Articles of Association that are really bulletproof for you to be able to manage and run your organization. The next point is the business scope, and I've highlighted this already based on the forms of legal presence that can actually be established. The business scope is really the critical, for me, it's the heart to your operation. You are creating the business scope based on the activities that you're going to be performing in the Chinese market. And why is this so critical? Because there are a lot of activities that are still restricted for foreign investors that you need to be aware of. So you've got to make sure that whatever you're planning on doing in the Chinese market is legal and you are able to perform it. And the second issue, which nobody realizes in the early stages of establishing a business, is that every single LLC has to do an audit at the end of the year. If you choose a good auditor, which should be your main objective, the auditor will question transactions that are not within your business scope. And then potentially you could have an audit that is not in good standing. So you need to be aware of all these connections, all these dots that are connected, not only with the establishment of your company, but also what could happen once the company is established and you've started operating. Now, there are standard business scopes that are usually issued by the MOFCOM and the Administration of Industry and Commerce, and these are the authorities that are going to approve the business scope upon the establishment of the company. But you can always expand on that. So if I would give you the example of management consulting company, this is primarily what Kohler Group is. We are a management consulting company, but we've added additional items into our business scope to allow us to perform accounting tax functions. And an additional licenses are required to do that. So you also need to be aware, if you want to add to the standard template, it's not an issue. You just need to be privy to the information as to whether additional licenses are required in order to be able to add those items inside. So it is a complex procedure. It's something you shouldn't take lightly. In many other jurisdictions in the world, you can actually be generally very vague. Like in Hong Kong, for example, when you incorporate an entity, you just write import-export, but you can do anything else around it unless you need an additional license. So in China, just keep that in mind. Business scope, it's the heart line to your business, and you should really be aware of what you are permitted and not permitted in doing. A representative office, as I mentioned earlier, has, again, specific business scope it's a template provided by the government, but with a rep office, you cannot change that business scope. It's standardized. And here I've listed two items which are commonly approved by the MOFCOM and the AIC in relation to what a representative office can actually do. And as you can see, it's very much superficial activities, liaison activities associated with what you're doing on the ground. Now, we are going to be having a Q&A session at the end of this presentation, but I did want to highlight the most common questions that are asked to us by companies that are looking to come into the market. So the first is, can I change, update, add, remove items from my business scope? Can you change your business scope? Yes, you can. Can you update it? Yes. Can you add items? Yes. Can you remove items? Yes, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that. In the end of the day, you want to have as broad as possible a business scope as you can in order to be able to do everything you want to do in the short and in the long term of your operation. So ideally, from day one, you're going to have an extensive business scope, which includes everything that you plan to do short term as well as long term. Naturally, if your business model changes, then certain things will have to change in your business scope. The only thing you need to be aware of is time frame in order to be able to update your business scope. Usually the standardized form or the standardized procedure lasts between 8 to 12 weeks. It's an application procedure, very bureaucratic in China. Documents need to be signed, but it doesn't mean it won't be approved. It's just a matter of the bureaucracy of actually doing this application. Now, what are the implications if I move from a consulting business scope to a trading business scope or to a manufacturing business scope, or I want to add retail and e-commerce? Well, thankfully, you don't actually have to close down the entity and reopen the entity. You just have to go through the procedure of updating your business scope. What do you need to be aware of? Going from a consulting company to a trading company, very straightforward. Actually, you're just adding import-export functions, domestic sales functions, and you just need to highlight the products you would be trading in. If you're moving into a manufacturing business scope, then the key point here is that you cannot be located in a commercial office building. You would need to relocate into a factory because you are saying that you are manufacturing. So you have to be aware of that as well. There are a lot of items, whenever you change one thing, it may reflect on a series of other dots that are located within that whole process. And in this case, it's the dot of the registered office address. If you want to add retail, then the key point is you need to have a retail space and have a lease agreement in a retail space. If you want to do e-commerce, you have to get an additional license, which is the Internet Content Providing License, before you can even add e-commerce into your business scope. So you can move along the ladder from a consulting to a trading to a manufacturing to add retail to add e-commerce, but you need to know how this is going to affect other areas of your operation from an administrative perspective. Now, the key question that I get is, I want to go into the Chinese market, but really I'm at a phase right now where I am still learning about the market. I'm in this market research phase, so I feel that a representative office will suffice to what I have to do today. But in a year's time, 18 months, 2 years, if business goes well, I would want to then upgrade into an LLC and have a consulting business scope, trading business scope, or manufacturing business scope. And that's the biggest dilemma that most companies run into. A representative office cannot be converted into an LLC. So you need to keep that in mind. What does that actually mean? It means you have to establish an LLC. Once it's established, transfer the employees from the rep office to the LLC, transfer assets from the rep office to the LLC, and then close down the representative office. And the key component with all of that is you most likely will want to stay in the same registered office address, which is a dilemma and a problem that we will touch on later on, because you can only have one company registered in one office address location. But let's touch on that in the later slides. Investment capital requirements are, again, a key issue and a key point for most investors. One of the biggest frustrations that I face by companies is the fact that they don't create budgets, they don't create cash flow analyses, they don't create business plans in relation to establishing their entity in China. As such, they do not know how much capital they need and what they need to invest into the entity in China. So the first point that I recommend to anybody that's not yet in the market: do a business plan, do a cash flow analysis, create your financial budget for the establishment. Kohler Group can assist in many of those functions, but we need to understand very clearly what you're actually going to be doing and performing. We need to understand the insides and outs. So most of the time, the CFO of your parent company should really be formulating that. And we can then add tips and advisory associated with China regulations and what you need to know from a China perspective. Now, the PRC company law says since March 1st, 2014, so actually since 2 years, that there are no minimum investment requirements in China, which for me was the biggest relief ever, because people ended up being lazy, not wanting to create these business plans and these budgets, and just going ahead and going along with the minimum requirements, and realizing after 3 to 6 months that more cash was needed, and they couldn't sustain their operations. So the fact that the PRC company law has abolished this minimum requirement is a huge relief to me, because it really is forcing companies to do the required initial budgetary needs for setting up a company in China. In addition, there is no schedule in relation to contribution of the capital. So you either can contribute all at once, you can contribute throughout your establishment period. There's no deadline in regards to that, which is again a huge relief to many. Now, the company law has also abolished the minimum requirement that has to be submitted to the bank upon registration or issuance of the business license and the opening of the bank accounts. However, in reality, most Administration of Industry and Commerce's and MOFCOMs still require that 20% of the registered capital is injected at the time of the bank account opening. Again, abolished in company law, but in reality and in practice, that's what they want to see, that at least 20% is injected. There are no minimum ratio cash contributions, so you can contribute the cash in cash, or you can contribute as assets. Now, the difficulty with contributing as assets is the fact that you need to have an evaluation done on those assets. And that can cause a lengthy period of time in terms of getting an evaluation report done and making sure that evaluation report is true and valid. One of the key points also is that your business license, when it is issued, will no longer state the investment capital or the registered capital that's been invested. So that's a good point, because there's no more bureaucracy around constantly updating your business license when cash is being contributed or when assets are being contributed. Now, in comparison, a representative office versus an LLC, there are no capital requirements. Because it's a liaison office and because it's tied to the parent company, basically the parent company is just funding the rep office on a monthly basis or quarterly basis so that expenses can be paid. There's no real capital investment that's being made. But you should still budget for it. You should still know how much capital do you need for a representative office to be able to maintain and sustain all the expenses that you're going to incur. So, key points for consideration. Am I able to increase my registered capital and total investment? Yes, you are. Just be aware that your registered capital is the liability of the company. So should you declare bankruptcy, should you be sued, it's all going to be up to the registered capital amount. Are there differences from city to city based on this new regulation from 2 years ago, meaning that the registered capital has the amount, there are no minimum amounts any longer? Unfortunately, there are differences, even though the company law states there shouldn't be. In many of the Tier 2, Tier 3, Tier 4 cities, they are requiring minimum investments from foreign investors. Whereas the Tier 1 cities, they really do follow the principles of the company law, and the requirements have been abolished. Are you able to decrease your registered capital and total investment? Meaning, business has gone so well, you've been receiving cash from clients on a timely basis, you don't need to inject any further capital to sustain your business. Now, in the Articles of Association, in the template that's provided by the government, there is a clause inside which states that you are not able to decrease your registered capital and total investment. Regardless of this clause, you are able to submit an application to the MOFCOM and the Administration of Industry and Commerce to decrease. Whether it will be approved or not is subjective to their discussions with you. And why? They may want to see financial statements, they may want to see a forecast and how business will develop in order to be able to approve this decrease of registered capital and total investment. Is registered capital utilized as working capital? Yes, it is. Loans in China, as they are known as loans in the Western world, they don't exist in China. You cannot just loan money to a Chinese company and expect payment back. That doesn't exist. So the registered capital that's going to be injected into your bank account in China is capital that you're going to be utilizing as your startup of your business in China, and it'll be used to pay off expenses, etc. And the last question, which I've already answered, is a representative office, if it doesn't have registered capital, how can it operate and how can it function? Very simply, it operates and it functions by just transferring funds from the head office, the shareholding company, to the representative office to pay for expenses. Now, opening bank accounts in China, this is quite an interesting aspect that people are not always understanding very clearly. When you open accounts in China, you have to open 3 accounts. One is the capital account. The capital account is solely utilized for registered capital, investment capital. For example, if you're applying for loans locally in China, all of that is going to be transferred into this capital account. It's going to be verified by the bank, and at that point, it can be transferred into the settlement accounts. The settlement accounts are made up of multi-currency accounts. So you'll have the renminbi basic account, which is a must. You can have a euro account, a Hong Kong dollar account, a US dollar account, a yen account, as you wish. The issue is from the capital account to the settlement account, you'll have to split the funds between the renminbi basic and potentially the other foreign currencies. The renminbi basic account is utilized for all your daily transactions, paying suppliers locally, paying service providers locally, paying all your expenses in terms of rent, salaries. In addition to that, if you are selling on the market, you're going to be receiving funds from customers into that renminbi basic account. The foreign currency accounts in your settlement account are utilized for overseas transactions. So you cannot transact locally in China in foreign currency. You can only transact in renminbi. So you need to keep that in mind. The foreign currency accounts and the settlement accounts are only utilized for overseas transactions. The tax account, which is an account that nobody usually is aware of, is an account that needs to be opened because whenever you do tax declarations, which for VAT and for business tax are done monthly, it needs to be, and individual income tax, it needs to be transferred into the tax account so that the tax bureau can automatically deduct the tax liability that you've declared on a monthly basis. Now, questions that I get: foreign bank or local bank? What should I choose? What are the differences? Foreign banks, it takes almost 6 to 8 weeks to open the accounts, primarily because of the local regulations with the People's Bank of China that they must follow in terms of know your client requirements and processes. So it's not the fault of the foreign banks that it takes such long. They're forced to go through those periods, which just means that it's much faster to open accounts with the local Chinese banks. So depending on the speed you need, just be aware of that. Foreign banks, almost all employees are bilingual, English, Chinese. The local Chinese banks, depending on where you're establishing your company and depending which branch you're opening with, you're less likely to find bilingual staff unless you open the accounts out of the head office or at one of the most common branches where you know you're going to find English speakers. So be aware of that. Legal representative, whoever you've appointed as the legal representative, is required to be present at the account opening. Usually, it suffices to just show the original passport. They don't really care to see the individual himself. So most of the time, if the legal rep is unable to travel, original passports can be couriered over. Obviously, disadvantage is potential loss of the passport. But that is a risk unless the legal rep doesn't want to fly over. What do you need to be aware of to operate the accounts? The first is, who's going to be the contact person to deal with the bank, to communicate with the bank if there are issues? Is it going to be somebody who's sitting abroad, or is it somebody who's going to be sitting locally? Now, there's no right or wrong answer here. It really comes down to your business model and how you are planning to operate in the market. But you need to be aware who is going to actually be the communication point. Who's going to operate the account? Are you going to have a cashier locally? Are you going to have an accountant locally? Are you going to use an outsourced provider to do it? Are you going to have someone from your home jurisdiction do it? Again, just operational items that you need to be aware of. Online banking does exist in China. The only issue is that the name of the beneficial owner needs to be written in Chinese characters. So you do need to have somebody operate the online banking who does write in Chinese to be able to import who the, not the beneficial owner, I apologize, it's it's the remittance party that has to all be written in Chinese. Corporate credit cards is a question I get quite often, and I think this really comes down to the bank you're choosing, whether the bank, most foreign banks don't have this option available to them just because of local PBOC regulations. So, it is a matter of speaking with the banks to see whether they offer that type of service. Now, in general, my recommendations for banks, you as a business owner should be traveling to China, visiting with a variety of banks, understanding the services that they offer, and you should be evaluating what bank suits your needs the most. Don't do this from abroad. It doesn't make sense. Go to China, visit these branches, visit these banks, and see who you are comfortable working with. That would be my key suggestion to anybody that is looking to open a bank account. Because everybody has different experiences. And everyone is willing to share their experiences, but it will never give you an outcome unless you physically go to those banks, meet with the people and the representatives yourself, and get a feeling. Now, I get constant complaints from companies and clients saying, and mind you, it's also in the media all the time, China is bureaucratic, it takes so long to establish a company, things are never being improved. And quite frankly, after being in China for 13 years, I completely disagree with everybody, and I usually get very frustrated, primarily because they haven't seen the changes that have occurred over the last 13 years. And I just wanted to highlight here one of the most recent changes that occurred in October 2015 to highlight the direction that the Chinese government is going in. And this is a minor change, but it is still a change that for us in the corporate service industry has really impacted our day-to-day job. Basically, when you establish a company in China, you get a whole series of documentation and certificates and licenses, and you always need to track all of these documents. In addition to that, it's basically one certificate per government bureau, which again makes it quite a hassle in terms of, always updating them, always going to the various bureaus, etc. In October 2015, the Administration of Industry and Commerce, as well as the MOFCOM, came out with the regulation that from now on, you will only have a business license, and we call it the 3-in-1 business license. What does it mean? It means that there is now a unified social credit code, which is a number. You can kind of consider it like your business number that is going to be unified amongst all government offices, primarily the MOFCOM, the AIC, the Public Security Bureau, and the Tax Bureau, which is phenomenal. It actually shows that the Chinese government, all these government bureaus are now interconnecting with each other, and they're using one company code to gain access and background on your company. It's a great, great development that's occurring in the market. What does this all mean? It actually means that when you establish a company in China, 2 steps are abolished, saving you almost 2 weeks of time to establish your company. It doesn't reduce it tremendously. It still takes about 5 months to establish a company in China, but by eliminating already these 2 weeks and eliminating all the bureaucratic procedures that have to occur once your company is established, it's a fantastic development. Now, when people come to me and say, oh, everything is bureaucratic, yes, it's all about paperwork, it's all about signing paperwork, etc. But knowing that the Chinese government is moving in the direction of eliminating steps in the application procedure, it's phenomenal. And it's also phenomenal that all the government bureaus are tied together with one company code now. It's a great, great progress. And you shouldn't feel frustrated. If you work with a corporate service provider or with a law firm who's been in the market for such a long time, then the actual procedure of establishing the company should be relatively smooth. And you'll just be aware of what obstacles exist along the way. And I'd like to remind everybody here, in 13 years, I've never had one application procedure that has gone the same as another. There have always been obstacles that have arisen, whether it's for the notarization of the documents in the home jurisdiction, whether it's for directors signing the documents with the wrong ballpoint pens, and I'm serious, you have to sign with a black ballpoint pen. All of these things are very critical to the application procedure, and that is what causes the bureaucracy and the frustration. But if you work with providers, and there are thousands of us on the market that know how things are done, that are organized, that will explain the procedures, then actually generally you just have to be patient for those 5 months, just wait until the documents and certificates are issued, but it is smooth sailing. Now, moving on to the corporate structure of the entity. This is quite critical, and the first tip that I'm going to be giving to all of you is the following. Choose the right people for your structure in China from day one. I've had cases where within 1 year there was so much turnover within the company that almost every 2 months we were doing a change for the corporate structure, which again, it's all bureaucratic procedures you just don't want to deal with. In addition to that, if you fire somebody or somebody resigns, you need to make sure you have a replacement, a backup, immediately on hand in order to do the change. Otherwise, the person registered at the government office is still liable for that position. So you need to be aware, again, of all these legalities that exist around developing your corporate structure. The shareholder of the entity, whether it's a corporate entity or an individual, is the highest point of authority. That shareholder is the decision maker for what occurs in the Chinese investment. But you then have a board of directors, which is made up of at least 3 people, or an executive director, which is 1 person. They are basically setting out the agenda and the goals and the targets for the operation in China, and they should be doing board meetings on an annual basis, if not more frequently. The key point here is no one is regulating whether board meetings are actually occurring. You then have the general manager, who is appointed by the board of directors or the executive director. The general manager must be named within the application procedure of the entity. You have the legal representative, who is usually the chairman of the board or is the executive director, but does not have to be. And they are the first point of contact for any government office for questions that occur. So the legal representative is a serious position, shouldn't be taken lightly. Will that person end up going to jail? That's the most frequently asked question that I receive. Yes, if that person has been involved in any criminal activities, yes, they will be going to jail just like anybody else who is involved in criminal activities. The supervisor is an interesting position because this doesn't really exist in the Western world. It stems a lot from multinational companies that have unions. The supervisor is outside of the board of directors, GM, and legal rep. They are basically parallel to them. They are appointed by the shareholder to supervise that all the targets, goals, compliance issues that are the responsibility of the board of directors and the GM and the legal rep are in compliance with PRC regulations. So the supervisor, in my opinion, when I view it, should really be someone who has a CFO role, COO role, CEO role in the home jurisdiction, that can really have a view on what is going on within the market and should have a view on what's going on in the market and should be responsible to declare to the shareholder things are not going well. For representative offices, a chief representative must be appointed. That's the only person that must be appointed in the corporate structure. And the chief representative is identical to the legal representative for an LLC that I had mentioned. So they are the first point of contact in case anything goes sour within the company. In terms of the key considerations, I've basically outlined tips, recommendations, but if you do have further questions related to the corporate structure or you need a little bit of guidance, then by all means, let us know and we'd be happy to contact you. The requirements of the chief representative, this is very different than an LLC and obviously needs to be taken into consideration if you are thinking of establishing a representative office. Basically, the key point here that's most critical is that the chief representative, if they are living in China or not living in China, they are liable to declare personal income tax in China. This has nothing to do with an LLC. It's purely for representative office and whoever holds the chief rep position. That's the most critical point when you're making that decision as to choose a chief representative. So no matter residing in China, not residing in China, this person has to pay taxes or declare taxes in China. So very critical in choosing the right person for that. Registered office address. Now here are where a lot of dilemmas arise. The first is, in China, one office address can be used for one legally registered company. Now I'll compare this to Hong Kong. In Hong Kong, you can have thousands, if not millions of companies registered in one office location. In China, only one company can be registered in one location. In addition, virtual office concepts do not exist in China. If you rent an office space, it has to be a real space. And that's a key point that needs to be considered. It has to be a real space. Now, for most startup companies, what they will do is they will go to business centers. And the business centers have one-person workstations, two-person workstations, three-person workstations. Basically, you need to have a minimum of a one-person workstation in order to be able to register your company. Now, key points for consideration. What are the implications if you change your registered office address? There are severe complications that can arise. Let's use Shanghai as an example. If you decide to choose an office in Jing'an district and you are expanding, you're growing in size, and you can only find a nice new office location in Luwan district, it means you need to do a closure audit with the tax bureau in Jing'an and reopen with the tax bureau in Luwan, because your taxes are associated with the district that your registered office address is located in. Very critical point to realize prior to establishing your legal presence in China. Choose not only the city you want to be in, but choose correctly the district that you want to be in, because you're going to be tied to the tax bureau in that district. And think long term. If you expand, if you grow, are there enough offices in that district that you can find to move into if you are expanding? Because changing district to district can be a nightmare. For companies that are doing trade transactions, it could very well be that for a period of 8 to 12 weeks, you are unable to issue VAT invoices to your customers because you're doing a closure audit and reopening with the new tax bureau. So there would be a halt to your business. Implications in changing the city in which you're established in. So I do get this actually quite a lot as well, saying I have established in Shenzhen my entity. Shenzhen was really the wrong place for me to establish. I really should have set up in Beijing. Big problem. All the government bureaus are located in Shenzhen for that legal entity. If you want to now open in Beijing, you actually have to liquidate the company in Shenzhen and open your new company in Beijing. A loophole around that is just downsizing the Shenzhen office and opening a branch office in Beijing, which then becomes your operational entity and becomes bigger than the head office, which is in Shenzhen. That's usually the quickest and the fastest way of handling things, but is obviously not clean cut and not transparent. But that's an evaluation that you are able to make internally by yourselves. Now, as I mentioned very early on in my presentation, I indicated that representative offices are really not as common as they used to be. And most companies now are willing to take the risk and commitment primarily because there is this abolishment in terms of the minimum registered capital requirements. They go straight ahead and set up an LLC. I all want you to be aware of the legal liabilities of a representative office if, one, you do things outside of the scope that I indicated to you, and you are basically doing false activities under the representative office. Now, why am I so fixated on this? It's because the business scope for a representative office is extremely vague. And most companies, what they will do is they will say, I want to go with a rep office because I don't have to commit funds, I don't have to make investment capital, Initially, I'm anyway going to have small quantities of staff, but they get lazy. And over a certain period of time, they end up having 50 people sitting in that representative office. And ultimately, if you have 50 people, certain operations would be occurring. For example, negotiating contracts, negotiating fees, dealing more with operational activities versus just liaison activities. And if you go outside of this business scope and you are found out or inspected by the various government offices, penalties can arise. The worst being up to 500,000 RMB, which is not huge amounts of money. But if you are a small business and a small operation, it could impact you tremendously. Worst case scenarios that could exist, and I have seen this happen, is that one, your licenses are revoked. The company name, meaning the shareholders' company name, is blacklisted within the Administration of Industry and Commerce and MOFCOM's websites. Meaning that if that shareholding entity wants to establish a company in China ever again, they will be blacklisted and will not be permitted to do so. Meaning, most likely, you have to set up a new shareholding entity in order to enter the market. In addition, whoever has been appointed as the chief representative, although he may enter China and do business in China, he would not be able to hold a position as chief representative ever again, and in some instances as a legal representative as well. So there are severe repercussions if you are doing things outside of the scope of a representative office. Now, my last slide is really looking at the LLC versus the representative office. And, again, these are my opinions in relation to it. I think from my perspective, here's the following. If you're going into China and you're planning on setting up an entity, whether in your mind you're thinking of a representative office or in your mind you're thinking of an LLC, you've already made that decision to commit to the Chinese market. So why not commit in the full way by establishing an LLC? It promotes prestige, it promotes image, it gives confidence to your employees that you have a permanent structure in China. For most people in China, the concept of a representative office, it's a liaison office, it's an intermediary, it's something that is not definitive for the long term. So by establishing an LLC, you have the means of providing greater flexibility in terms of your business scope and what you want to do, both in the short and in the long term. It allows you to hire as many people as you like as your business grows and expands without feeling worried that you might be doing something under the table or illegally. And in addition, if you structure it correctly, you could also develop tax-optimized solutions. So these are all key points to consider when you're really comparing LLC versus representative office. In addition to all of that, what people also really don't understand and don't realize is that once you've established your representative office, for most people the concept is, oh, it's a rep office, it's a liaison office, there are no further maintenance requirements required by the government bureaus. That's an absolute false perception. Representative offices are actually required to do the same amount of corporate compliance procedures as an LLC has to do. In addition to that, something which is an added item is that every year you need to notarize the company kit of the shareholding entity, which costs money, is difficult sometimes to obtain depending on the jurisdiction of the parent company, and may delay procedures for your corporate compliance procedures. So, have all the information on your plate in order to be able to understand these decision-making processes. Now, obviously, my goal for today's presentation is establishing a legal presence in China, but I wouldn't be doing justice if I also didn't inform you about, if you're not successful in the market, what options do you have in terms of liquidation and rep office closure. Now, obviously, you are able to liquidate your entity, or you are able to close your representative office. For an LLC, the liquidation procedure is critical depending on how it's all outlined in your articles of association. What are your exit strategies from the market if you do want to liquidate? It has to be specified in the articles of association. Now, for an LLC, a liquidation process can usually take, on average, 18 months, primarily because the first step is a tax closure audit, which is an audit that reflects back on the previous 3 years of company accounts. It's a lengthy audit, and usually the tax bureau will take approximately 8 to 9 months to review the audit, review all of the supporting documentation to verify that there are no further tax liabilities owed by the company. For a rep office closure, it's exactly the same procedures, but obviously on a much smaller scale because the representative office only is a cost center and has expenses. So the procedure is identical, the time frame will obviously be less, but I've had situations where rep office closures have taken much longer times than LLC liquidations, primarily because the tax bureaus don't consider them serious and they put them on the bottom of their filing lists for doing reviews. So be aware of that as well. Now, the last slide really for me is looking at the top 10 tips for establishing a legal presence in China. The first is doing your market research on what the right structure is for you. Compare rep office with LLC. Understand what would be the right business scope for you based on your short and long-term goals and objectives for this company in China. Understand what is the right location for you, which city, which district. Make sure you find right office address locations. Research the areas. Talk to real estate or agents about the growth in that district. The next is establishing the right culture from day one. Now, the main case study I can highlight here is the following. You may have already hired someone to develop your China business. He's sitting in China. He's not legally employed. He's probably, hopefully, signed at least a freelance agreement with your head office to manage and operate the functions in China. He has said to you, allow me to set up the company on your behalf. Worst case scenario I can offer in that situation is company has never been set up. You have a team of 20 people that are not legally employed. You're not even aware if employment contracts have been signed. And you're not aware of just general corporate compliance issues. You've never seen business licenses. You've never seen certificates. You've been given financial statements, but you don't know, because they're only in Chinese, whether they're properly approved. Now, when I say develop the right culture from day one, yes, you need to adapt to the Chinese culture. Absolutely, 100%. But it doesn't mean that you shouldn't protect yourself and get external advisors to help you to know if your company is in compliance or not. And trust me when I say this, it will cost you much less to be protected from day one versus get into a situation that you have to fix and primarily the legal liability befalls you as the shareholding company. So make sure you develop the right culture from day one. Avoid a lack of attention and communication with your partners and your team. I get a lot of comments saying, oh, time zone issues, we're a 12-hour flight away at least, if not 16 hours if you're located in the US. How do you expect me to keep attention and keep communication up and running? Well, first of all, communication nowadays is much easier with Skype, telephone. It's not impossible to keep in touch with your team and your staff and your partners on a day-to-day basis. And to avoid a lack of attention, have different people from different divisions in the head office fly out to China to supervise the various divisions that have been created locally. It's not rocket science. You do need to pay for flight tickets, and obviously there are expenses generated around it. But again, protecting your business and making sure that you're in compliance is a key point to remember. Ethical situations arise almost every day in China. You get into situations where you're in meetings with suppliers, you're in meetings with customers, or you're even in meetings just internally with your staff members, and you are being required, if not pushed, to do something that you know is not right, that you know is not a right workflow, that you know has undertones of being something that could potentially be not legal in China, but you're not 100% sure. Again, there are thousands of advisors on the ground in China that can give you that information. And one of the key cultural issues that I've learned over the last 13 years in China is that the Chinese love to play on the patience of Westerners. and they push and they push and they push. It's in your prerogative to say, stop, let me research, let me find out. You may lose bids, but it's better to have been in the right situation, knowing the right facts before signing any type of deal that could have caused you to be in a non-compliant situation. So be aware of ethical situations. And, one of the most common phrases in China is, oh, well, it's China. Yes, I know it's China, but that doesn't mean you have to do things in compliant ways. Dealing with inexperienced foreign and local staff. This really came about during the financial crisis when people had severe budget cuts. They had to localize their businesses in China, and they ended up hiring people that were newly graduated to reduce budget costs for headcount. It only caused issues because people, when they're new graduates or they're not experienced within your industry, or they don't even know the philosophy of your company, and they don't really understand the real goals and objectives, or they don't even know how to negotiate with customers and suppliers, it doesn't help you with growing your business. You really do need qualified staff that can help you and assist you and have the experience to develop your business. Register your IP. It's a common issue. You'd be surprised. There's still so many companies out there that don't register their IP, don't register their trademarks and patents. There are plenty of IP squatters in the market that are just purchasing and registering trademarks and patents so that they can play off of it and get money from you. Be aware of being in those situations. Registering trademarks is one of the easiest things to do in China. It does take time, but to actually file the registration, it's a piece of cake. And you really should get on the ball to get that done. When you're establishing your business in China, be aware of additional licenses that you may require. As I mentioned during the business scope phase, clarify your business scope, clarify if you need additional licenses to be able to operate and perform those certain activities. Be aware of government interaction. For me, this is a key point. Primarily if you're establishing in Tier 3, Tier 4 cities, it's less likely to occur in Tier 1, Tier 2 cities today. If you do go out into those areas, the local governments are trying to attract foreign investors. They may want to promote certain things, like, for example, if you're developing a manufacturing facility, they will give you 5 years free rent, or they will give you free rent until your first year of profitability. If they only give you that information verbally, don't rely on it and don't budget for it. Only budget for things that are promised to you in writing and aren't chopped. Otherwise, serious repercussions can occur at a later stage. Why do I say that? Because government offices have huge turnovers of staff. So if you've been promised something today, March 11th, 2016, but it only becomes reality in 2 to 3 years' time, and that person is no longer sitting in that office, and you have nothing in writing and nothing chopped, then you have no way to verify the information and nobody will believe you. So be aware of government interaction. Key takeaway, make sure you have everything in writing. Appoint senior directors, senior management personnel in the corporate structure. Carefully choose who those people are. Be aware of turnovers and always having to update any changes that occur within the government bureaus. And last but not least, obtain advice and pay for it. I can't emphasize that more. I have a lot of clients also that they want to spread out their corporate service providers. So they'll have a law firm handling the incorporations. They'll have an accounting firm handling accounts, tax, payroll. They'll have a recruitment firm or a headhunting firm assist with headcount and developing the headcount, et cetera, et cetera. They'll have an audit firm just doing the audit. It's great getting all these various service providers, and choosing the right service provider and vetting them is always not an easy task. But make sure you get those service providers. Make sure you get advice from them. Pay for that advice initially. It will, in the long term, protect you tremendously. So that is the end of today's presentation, and I'll give the microphone back to Barbara, who will lead the Q&A.
All right, Christina, there are a series of questions that have come in during your presentation. Let's start with the first one. Avoiding inadvertently establishing a presence, for example, an overseas employee spending greater than 183 days in China on a contract. How does this work, and is it legal?
That's a very good question. So there are a lot of companies out there who are not yet ready to commit to the Chinese market. They're not ready to establish a presence, but They do send somebody either from their home jurisdiction or they do hire somebody locally to begin and operate their business. Let's start off with if you send a foreigner from overseas. The key point here is if he's traveling to China and he's there for less than 6 months in a calendar year, you have no issues. He's permitted to do the research, to sign a lease agreement. You don't need to show a residence visa. He may just have to travel in and out of China based on the visa that he has. But you're not running into any permanent establishment issues for your head office. If he stays for more than 183 days, you will have permanent establishment issues, and that you need to take into consideration. If you decide to hire a local mainland Chinese to help you with this research or to help you develop the business before you set up a legal entity, be aware of the following. One, sign something with him. Sign some form of agreement. Freelance agreements are not black and white legally permitted in China. They're very gray in terms of being permissible, but sign something that protects you. Why? Because mainland Chinese individuals that are based and residing in mainland China, they should, if they're receiving any type of income, should be declaring personal income tax and should be paying their portion of their social insurance to the various labor bureaus. If they don't do that, then actually this individual could go to the labor arbitration and say you as the overseas shareholding company are responsible. You don't want to get into situations where people that you are indirectly hiring have leverage over you. You want to protect yourself. And whether it's a Westerner that's being relocated to China or whether it's a mainland Chinese that you're hiring locally, make sure you have all of the information at your fingertips to know what risks exist if you take that route. And make sure that you always have the leverage to protect yourself and to protect the overseas entity.
Okay, there was another question coming in. Establishing a limited company with 3 branches in 4 different cities in China, what are the difficulties companies are facing in those branches? For example, at visa applications for foreigners, at the corporate management of the entities, at accounting and tax issues or consolidation of accounts, or the business scope associated with the branches?
That's quite a long question. So I guess let me just rephrase it quickly. If you already have an entity in China and you're looking to set up branch offices in China, how can you manage everything for those branch offices? Let me give you a bit of background on branch offices. There are 2 types of branches that exist in China. One is a non-operational and one is an operational. A non-operational branch functions like a representative office in China, meaning it's a liaison office. Actually, you do need to register with the local tax bureau, but you have expenses and you're declaring expenses and that's it. And the work is easily consolidated then with the parent company in China. If you set up operational branch companies, this is where it gets a little bit more complex because that branch is a type of independent structure that is doing everything locally. It can apply for visas. It can do its own accounts. It would just need to send the accounts to the head office for consolidation purposes. But in theory, it's like an independent LLC that's managing itself alone. It's just tied to a company that is based in China. That's all. Branch offices are a little bit tricky in some regards because the issue is really around the business scope. A branch of an LLC in China has to follow the same business scope as the LLC. So I'll give you an example. If you've set up a manufacturing company as the main LLC and you now want to set up sales offices, that's not an issue. Primarily because a manufacturing entity has the broadest and widest range of business scope possible because it can do manufacturing, it can do trade, and it can do service. If you now are a trading entity, trading LLC, and you want to set up a manufacturing branch, unfortunately, that's not possible. The branch has to have the same business scope or has to have less items in its business scope than the LLC will So really with branches, that's the main issue that exists around them.
Okay, another question was the following. What are the requirements if the corporate structure is made up of local mainland Chinese individuals or individuals from Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan? Is it permissible? Are there complications?
That's a very good question. So in the corporate structure, as I highlighted earlier, you have the shareholder, which is obviously the overseas entity or the overseas individual, and then you have to develop this board of directors, legal rep, general manager. It is completely up to the company who you wish to decide to take on those roles and those positions. It can be mainland Chinese people, it can be Westerners, or it can be even people from Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Macau. There are absolutely no issues surrounding that whatsoever. The key point that I'm just going to reiterate is just make sure you choose the right amount, the correct people, so that there's not too much turnover that occurs in those situations.
Okay, so we are already at our last question from our attendee. We are looking to establish a limited company in China, but with several foreign shareholders. What type of entity is this, and what are the regulations that must be followed? Is this considered a joint venture in China?
So if you are looking to actually establish an entity in China and there are several foreign investors, so several foreign shareholders that are involved, it is not actually considered, according to law in China, as a typical Chinese joint venture. A Chinese joint venture is actually between Chinese investors and foreign investors. If you have just foreign investors and multiples, then it is still under the regime of a foreign invested company. It's just what you need to do is you still need to make sure there's a type of joint venture contract outlining the rules, regulations, the company laws associated with each investor. But other than that, it still falls under the regulations of a foreign invested entity.
Okay, thank you. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to answer all your questions today. But in case you have further questions or want to talk about your individual cases, please contact Christina privately after the webinar. Here on this slide, you can see her contact details. You will be receiving a copy of this presentation together with Christina's contact information. We hope that you enjoyed this webinar session. We just want to remind you of our upcoming webinars in this series. If you're interested, please register for the webinars on our website. The recording of this webinar will be posted on our YouTube channel and distributed on our social media sites such as LinkedIn, Sing, and Twitter. In addition, if you're interested in our weekly e-campaign highlighting all the latest resources we publish, do not hesitate to subscribe. It is free of charge and can be easily done on our homepage by inserting your email address into the section called chinainvest.biz. Thank you, Christina, for presenting to all the attendees and registrants. Thank you also to all for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you again soon. Have a pleasant evening and goodbye.